In the marble corridors of Thornwick Palace, where centuries of royal secrets lay buried beneath gilded portraits and whispered conversations, one discovery would unravel the carefully constructed facade of the most powerful family in the kingdom. When palace guard Marcus Holbrook stumbled upon a leather-bound diary hidden behind a loose stone in the East Wing's forgotten chamber, he had no idea that the elegant handwriting within would expose a truth so devastating that it would pit brother against stepmother, tear apart a dynasty, and force Crown Prince Alexander to choose between family loyalty and protecting the woman he loved. The diary belonged to Princess Isabella, Alexander's beloved wife, and its pages contained secrets that someone had been willing to kill to keep buried. The storm that lashed against the ancient windows of Thornwick Palace seemed fitting for the tempest brewing within its walls. Crown Prince Alexander Rothwell stood in his private study, his hands trembling as he clutched the leather diary that had changed everything. The fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows across his angular face, highlighting the exhaustion that had settled into his features over the past 3 sleepless nights. Marcus Holbrook, the loyal palace guard who had served the royal family for 15 years, shifted uncomfortably near the door. His weathered face showed the weight of the burden he now carried. He had been conducting his routine security inspection of the East Wing when he discovered the loose stone in what was once Princess Isabella's private retreat. Behind that stone, wrapped in silk and hidden away like a shameful secret, lay the diary that now threatened to destroy the royal family. "Your Highness," Marcus began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to understand that I never intended to read it. The binding was damaged, and, when I picked it up, it fell open too." Alexander raised his hand, silencing the guard. He knew Marcus well enough to trust his integrity. The man had risked his position, perhaps even his life, by bringing this directly to him instead of following protocol and reporting it to the Queen Consort Victoria, Alexander's stepmother who had married his father 5 years after his mother's death. The diary's pages fluttered as Alexander opened it again, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting of his wife, Princess Isabella. She had been keeping this journal during her stay at the private medical facility, documenting not just her recovery from what the public believed was a routine procedure, but something far more sinister. Day 12, the doctors continue to insist that the treatments are necessary, but I can see the fear in their eyes when Victoria visits. She speaks to them in hushed tones, always sending my personal attendants away. When I asked Dr. Harrison about the medication changes, he avoided my gaze and mumbled something about new protocols. I'm beginning to suspect that my illness isn't as straightforward as they've led Alexander to believe. Alexander's jaw clenched as he read the entry for the 3rd time. Isabella had been admitted to the Royal Medical Center 6 months ago for what was publicly announced as exhaustion and dehydration. The media had been told she was receiving the best care possible, and Alexander had been assured by Victoria that Isabella was in good hands. He had trusted his stepmother's judgment, believing she had Isabella's best interests at heart. Day 18, I overheard Victoria speaking with someone on the telephone today. She mentioned ensuring the succession remains clear and removing any obstacles to Edmund's future. Edmund is her son, Alexander's younger half-brother. The implications of what I heard make my blood run cold. Am I the obstacle she was referring to? The Crown Prince's hands shook as he turned the page. His wife's handwriting became more erratic as the entries progressed, reflecting her growing fear and deteriorating physical condition. Marcus cleared his throat gently. "Your Highness, there's something else you need to know. When I found the diary, I also discovered this." He produced a small glass vial from his pocket, its label partially torn but still readable. It was hidden with the diary. "The medication listed isn't what the royal physicians prescribed for Her Highness." Alexander took the vial, examining the label. The medication was a powerful psychotropic drug, one that could cause confusion, memory loss, and, in high doses, could be fatal. His mind raced back to Isabella's final weeks, how she had seemed increasingly disoriented and weak. The doctors had attributed it to her illness progressing, but now he realized there may have been a more sinister explanation. Day 25, I can barely hold the pen steady. The medications make everything feel like a dream, but, in my clearer moments, I understand what's happening. Victoria has been orchestrating this from the beginning. She needs me gone to secure Edmund's path to the throne. If something happens to me, Alexander will be devastated, but, eventually, he'll remarry someone of Victoria's choosing, someone who won't threaten her son's future. I've tried to tell the nurses, but they think the medication is making me paranoid. Perhaps it is, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm running out of time. The final entries were the most damning. Isabella had documented instances where Victoria had personally administered medications, claiming the nurses were busy. She had recorded conversations she had overheard between Victoria and unknown individuals, discussing timelines and contingencies. Most chilling of all, she had begun to suspect that her food was being tampered with. Day 30, I've stopped eating the meals that come directly from the main kitchen. Victoria insisted that I receive special dietary supplements, but, after consuming them, I always feel worse. I've been giving them to the small plant by my window instead. The plant died yesterday. I think I understand now why I'm getting sicker despite the doctor's assurances. I don't know if I'll have the strength to write again, but if someone finds this, please know that I never wanted to leave Alexander. I fought as hard as I could. The diary ended there. 3 days later, Princess Isabella had passed away. The official cause of death was complications from her illness, and the entire kingdom had mourned the loss of their beloved princess. Alexander had been inconsolable, and Victoria had been the picture of supportive family, helping him through his grief while simultaneously positioning her son Edmund as a more prominent figure in royal duties. Alexander closed the diary and looked at Marcus. The guard's loyalty was unquestionable, but they both knew the gravity of what they had discovered. Accusing the queen consort of murder was not something that could be done lightly, especially without concrete proof. The diary was compelling evidence, but Victoria's team of lawyers would likely argue that it was the product of a mind affected by illness and medication. Marcus, I need you to understand that this conversation never happened, Alexander said quietly. If Victoria discovers that you found this, your life will be in danger. I need time to figure out how to handle this properly. The guard nodded solemnly. What will you do, Your Highness? Alexander walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where he and Isabella used to walk together. I'm going to confront her, but I need to be strategic about it. Victoria is cunning, and she's had months to cover her tracks. If I approach this wrong, she could destroy any remaining evidence and paint me as a grieving widower who has lost touch with reality. The weight of the revelation was crushing. Alexander had spent months blaming himself for not being more attentive to Isabella's condition, for trusting the doctor's assessments, for not spending more time at the medical facility. Now he realized that his presence might have actually hindered Victoria's plans, which could explain why she had always found reasons for him to attend to royal duties when he wanted to visit his wife. As the night wore on, Alexander formulated his plan. He would need allies, people he could trust implicitly. His uncle, Lord Chancellor Robert Ashford, had never liked Victoria and might be willing to listen. Dr. Eleanor Whitmore, the kingdom's most respected forensic pathologist, might be able to examine Isabella's medical records for inconsistencies. Most importantly, he would need to gather more evidence before making any accusations. The next morning arrived gray and cold, matching Alexander's mood as he prepared for what would be the most difficult conversation of his life. Victoria had requested a private meeting to discuss Edmund's upcoming ceremonial duties, but Alexander had his own agenda. He had spent the early hours reviewing Isabella's diary once more, memorizing key passages and dates that he could reference during their confrontation. Victoria entered the blue drawing room with her characteristic poise, her silver hair perfectly styled and her navy dress impeccably tailored. She had always been beautiful, with the kind of refined elegance that made her a natural fit for royal life. Alexander's father had been smitten with her from their first meeting, and she had seamlessly transitioned into her role as queen consort after their marriage. Alexander, darling, she said warmly, approaching to kiss his cheek. You look tired. Are you sleeping well? The casual concern in her voice now struck him as deeply manipulative. How many times had she expressed similar worry about Isabella's condition while secretly orchestrating her decline? I've had some things on my mind, Alexander replied carefully, studying Victoria's face for any sign of guilt or nervousness. I'm sure you have. The anniversary of Isabella's passing is approaching, and I know how difficult this time of year is for you. Victoria settled gracefully into her chair, crossing her hands in her lap. That's actually part of what I wanted to discuss. Edmund has been thinking that it might be appropriate for him to take on some additional responsibilities to help lighten your load during this emotional period. The suggestion felt like salt in a wound. Victoria was using his grief as leverage to advance her son's position, just as Isabella's diary had suggested she would. Actually, Victoria, I wanted to talk to you about Isabella, Alexander said, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. I've been thinking a lot about her final weeks, and some things don't add up. For just a moment, he caught a flicker of something in Victoria's eyes. Fear? Calculation? It disappeared so quickly he might have imagined it, replaced by a look of motherly concern. Oh, darling, I know how hard it is to accept her loss. But the doctors did everything they could. Sometimes these things just happen, and we have to find a way to make peace with that. The medications she was receiving, Alexander continued, watching Victoria's reaction carefully. Do you remember the names of them? I've been reviewing her medical files, and some of the prescriptions seem unusual. Victoria's composure remained intact, but Alexander noticed her grip tighten slightly on her handbag. I'm not a medical professional, Alexander. I trusted the doctors completely, just as you did. Why are you torturing yourself with these details? Because I love my wife, and I need to understand what happened to her. Alexander's voice grew firmer. And because I've discovered some information that suggests her treatment may not have been as straightforward as we were told. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Victoria studied Alexander's face, and he could see her mind working, calculating her next move. Alexander, grief can make us see conspiracies where none exist. Isabella was very ill, and, despite everyone's best efforts, she couldn't be saved. I know you're looking for someone to blame, but sometimes tragedy just strikes without warning. It was a masterful response, positioning any accusations he might make as the product of grief-induced paranoia. But Alexander had expected this reaction, and he was prepared to push further. As the tension in the room built toward an inevitable confrontation, both Alexander and Victoria knew that the conversation was about far more than Isabella's medical care. It was about power, succession, and the lengths to which someone might go to secure their family's future. The next few moments would determine whether justice would prevail or whether Victoria's carefully constructed facade would continue to protect her from the consequences of her actions. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, each second amplifying the tension that filled the blue drawing room. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers drummed once against her handbag before she caught herself and stilled them. Alexander recognized the gesture. It was something she did when she was thinking quickly, calculating her next move in what had always been a complex game of royal politics. Alexander, Victoria said finally, her voice taking on a tone of gentle reproach, I'm concerned about you. This obsession with Isabella's medical records isn't healthy. Perhaps you should speak with Dr. Matthews about your emotional state. The suggestion that he might need psychiatric evaluation was both insulting and telling. Alexander realized that Victoria was already positioning herself to discredit anything he might say about Isabella's death. If she could paint him as mentally unstable, any accusations he made would be dismissed as the ravings of a grief-stricken man. My emotional state is perfectly fine, Alexander replied evenly. What concerns me is discovering that my wife was being given medications that weren't prescribed by her primary physician. This time, Victoria's reaction was unmistakable. Her eyes widened slightly before she regained control, but Alexander had seen enough to know that he had struck a nerve. I don't know what you think you've found, but you're clearly misunderstanding something, Victoria said, rising from her chair with fluid grace. Isabella received the best care possible from the most qualified physicians in the kingdom. If you have questions about her treatment, you should direct them to Dr. Harrison. Dr. Harrison left the country rather suddenly, after Isabella's death, Alexander observed. In fact, he relocated to Switzerland with enough money to purchase a villa overlooking Lake Geneva. Quite a coincidence for someone on a physician's salary. Victoria's facade began to crack ever so slightly. Are you suggesting something improper? Because if you are, I think you should be very careful about making unfounded accusations. Alexander stood as well, his height advantage making him tower over his stepmother. I'm not suggesting anything, Victoria. I'm stating facts. Dr. Harrison received a substantial payment shortly after Isabella's funeral. The medication found in Isabella's system wasn't part of her prescribed treatment plan. And there are witnesses to conversations you had about removing obstacles to Edmund's future. The last statement was a calculated risk. While Isabella's diary mentioned overhearing such a conversation, Alexander had no way to verify whether anyone else had witnessed it. But Victoria's reaction told him everything he needed to know. You're being ridiculous, Victoria snapped, her composure finally beginning to slip. Edmund is barely 22 years old, and he's shown no interest in challenging your position as heir. This entire conversation is bordering on paranoia. Then, you won't mind if I have Isabella's body exhumed for a more thorough examination? Alexander asked quietly. The color drained from Victoria's face. For a moment, she looked like she might faint, but she recovered quickly, gripping the back of her chair for support. That would be a desecration of her memory, Victoria said, her voice shaking with what Alexander now recognized as fear rather than indignation. Isabella deserves to rest in peace, not be subjected to your conspiracy theories. My wife deserves justice, Alexander countered. And, if you're innocent, then, an examination would only confirm that her death was natural. Victoria moved toward the window, her back to Alexander as she composed herself. When she turned around, her expression had hardened into something cold and calculating that Alexander had never seen before. You want to know the truth? Victoria said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The truth is that Isabella was weak. She was never going to be the kind of queen this kingdom needed. She was too soft, too emotional, too concerned with charity work and common people to understand the realities of ruling. Alexander felt his anger surge, but he forced himself to remain calm. Victoria was revealing her true feelings, and he needed to hear everything she had to say. But that doesn't mean I killed her, Victoria continued. She was genuinely ill, Alexander. The stress of royal life was destroying her, and she was having what the doctors politely termed adjustment difficulties. The medications were necessary to help her cope. The medications that aren't found in any of her official medical records? Alexander pressed. Victoria's laugh was bitter. Do you really think everything that happens in this family is documented for posterity? There are aspects of royal life that require discretion, Alexander. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. Such as deciding that my wife needed to die for the greater good? I never said she needed to die, Victoria shot back. But I won't pretend that her death wasn't convenient for certain long-term considerations. The admission hung in the air between them like poison. Alexander realized that Victoria had just confessed to viewing Isabella's death as beneficial, even if she wasn't explicitly admitting to causing it. Long-term considerations involving Edmund's future? Alexander asked. Victoria's expression grew even colder. Edmund is brilliant, ambitious, and born to rule. You've always been too sentimental, too concerned with being liked rather than being respected. Isabella encouraged those weaknesses in you. Her death forced you to grow stronger, more decisive. And if I refuse to be the kind of ruler you think I should be? Then, perhaps it's time to consider whether you're truly suited to be king, Victoria said with chilling calm. The threat was clear, though carefully worded. Victoria was suggesting that if Alexander didn't comply with her vision for the monarchy, she might work to have him removed from the line of succession in favor of Edmund. I see, Alexander said quietly. And, I suppose Edmund would be more amenable to your guidance? Edmund understands the realities of power in ways that you've never had to learn. He knows that sometimes difficult choices must be made for the stability of the kingdom. Alexander felt a chill as he realized that Victoria had likely been grooming Edmund for years, filling his head with ideas about the necessity of ruthless pragmatism and leadership. His half-brother, whom he had always viewed as a somewhat naive young man more interested in horses and hunting than politics, might be far more dangerous than Alexander had imagined.
does Edmund know about Isabella? Alexander asked.
Victoria's hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to provide Alexander with his answer. Edmund knows that Isabella was not the right queen for this kingdom, Victoria said carefully. He knows that her death, while tragic, opened opportunities for positive change.
That's not what I asked.
Edmund is loyal to this family and to the crown, Victoria replied, deflecting the question. His loyalty is something you can count on, as long as you make the right decisions going forward.
The implicit threat was becoming more explicit. Victoria was telling Alexander that his half-brother's support was conditional on Alexander falling in line with their agenda.
If he continued to pursue the truth about Isabella's death or refused to be the kind of king they wanted, he might find himself facing a challenge to his claim to the throne.
And what exactly would the right decisions look like? Alexander asked. Stop this investigation into Isabella's death. Allow the family to move forward. Consider remarriage to someone more suitable to royal life.
And begin involving Edmund more substantially in royal duties to prepare him for greater responsibilities.
Alexander understood now that this had always been the plan. Victoria had never intended for Alexander to be an independent ruler.
She wanted a puppet she could control, and if he proved unwilling to play that role, she was prepared to replace him with Edmund.
I need time to consider what you've said, Alexander told her.
Of course, Victoria replied, her diplomatic smile returning as if they had just finished discussing the weather rather than murder and treason.
But don't take too long, darling. Some opportunities have limited windows.
After Victoria left, Alexander remained in the blue drawing room for nearly an hour, processing everything that had transpired. The conversation had confirmed his worst fears about Isabella's death while revealing an even larger conspiracy involving his own future as king.
He needed allies, and he needed them quickly.
His uncle Robert would be his first stop, but Alexander realized he would also need to reach out to other members of the royal family and trusted advisors who might be willing to stand against Victoria's machinations. The diary had been just the beginning. Isabella's death was part of a larger plan to reshape the monarchy according to Victoria's vision, with Edmund as her chosen instrument of power. Alexander had inadvertently stumbled into a battle for the very soul of the kingdom, and he was no longer certain who he could trust. As he prepared to leave the room, Alexander caught sight of his reflection in the gilt-framed mirror that had hung there for 2 centuries. For the first time, he saw not just a grieving widower, but a king-in-waiting who would have to fight for his throne against the very people who should have been supporting him. The game Victoria had been playing for years was finally out in the open, and Alexander realized that everything he had believed about his family, his wife's death, and his own future had been built on lies. The question now was whether he had the strength and cunning necessary to outmaneuver a woman who had been planning this campaign for far longer than he had known it existed. The palace walls that had always represented security and tradition now felt like the confines of a prison, and Alexander understood that he was no longer just seeking justice for Isabella. He was fighting for his right to rule and his very survival in a family that viewed him as nothing more than an obstacle to their ambitions. The ancient oak doors of Lord Chancellor Robert Ashford's private chambers closed with a weight that seemed to echo through the centuries of secrets they had concealed. Alexander found his uncle seated behind an enormous mahogany desk, its surface covered with documents that bore the royal seal. Robert looked up from his work, his weathered face immediately showing concern at Alexander's haggard appearance. "Nephew," Robert said, rising from his chair with the careful movements of a man in his 70s.
"You look like you haven't slept in days. What's troubling you?"
Alexander had always felt comfortable with his uncle, one of the few people in the palace who had known him since childhood and never seemed to have an agenda beyond genuine affection for his family. Robert had been his father's closest advisor and had continued in that role during the early years of Victoria's marriage to the king. However, Alexander had noticed that his uncle's influence had waned considerably after Victoria became more established as queen consort. "Uncle, I need to speak with you about something that could change everything we thought we knew about Isabella's death," Alexander began, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Robert's expression grew serious as he gestured for Alexander to take a seat in one of the leather chairs positioned near the fireplace. "I've been waiting for this conversation," he said quietly.
The admission caught Alexander off guard. Waiting for it? Son, I've served this family for 40 years. I know when something doesn't smell right, and there were aspects of Isabella's illness and death that never made sense to me. Robert settled into the chair opposite Alexander, his blue eyes sharp with intelligence despite his age. But I also know the dangers of asking too many questions when powerful people want those questions to remain unasked. Alexander felt a surge of relief. Having his uncle's support would be crucial in whatever came next. Then, you'll help me get to the truth?
That depends on what truth you think you've discovered, and what you plan to do with it, Robert replied carefully. Alexander reached into his jacket and withdrew Isabella's diary, placing it on the small table between them. A palace guard found this hidden in Isabella's old retreat in the East Wing.
I think you should read it.
Robert took the diary with trembling hands, his expression growing darker with each page he turned. Alexander watched his uncle's face, noting the moments when Robert's jaw clenched or his breathing changed. When Robert finally finished reading, he closed the diary gently and sat back in his chair.
My God, Robert whispered.
I suspected Victoria was capable of ruthless behavior, but this. He shook his head slowly.
This is systematic murder disguised as medical treatment.
Yesterday, I confronted Victoria about it, Alexander continued. She didn't deny the implications. In fact, she made it clear that Isabella's death was convenient for their long-term plans, and that my cooperation going forward is not optional.
Robert's eyes flashed with anger. She threatened you? Not directly, but the message was clear.
If I don't fall in line with their vision for the monarchy, they're prepared to find ways to remove me from the succession in favor of Edmund.
Edmund, Robert repeated thoughtfully.
I've been watching that boy carefully since he turned 18. There's something different about him, something calculating that wasn't there when he was younger. I always assumed it was just the natural development of political awareness, but now I wonder if Victoria has been molding him into something more dangerous.
Alexander leaned forward. Do you think Edmund knows about Isabella? I think Edmund knows whatever Victoria wants him to know, and nothing more. She's too smart to make her son a full conspirator until she's certain of his loyalty and discretion.
Robert stood and began pacing, his mind clearly working through the implications.
But the real question is what we can prove, and what we can do about it. The diary is compelling evidence, but would it stand up in court? Court?
Robert stopped pacing and looked at Alexander with surprise. Nephew, you can't seriously be considering taking this through normal legal channels. Victoria is the queen consort. Any attempt to prosecute her would require approval from the Prime Minister, Parliament, and, ultimately your father.
Do you really think they would move against her based on a diary that could be dismissed as the paranoid ravings of a sick woman? The reality of their situation hit Alexander like a physical blow.
Even with evidence of Victoria's guilt, the political realities of bringing down someone in her position were almost insurmountable.
Then, what do you suggest?
Robert returned to his chair, his expression grave.
We need more evidence, and we need allies.
People in positions of power who would benefit from Victoria's downfall and would be willing to support us when the time comes to make our move.
Who did you have in mind? Prime Minister Harrison has never liked Victoria's influence over your father.
She's repeatedly interfered with government policies, and Harrison has privately expressed concerns about her growing power.
If we could present him with irrefutable evidence, he might be willing to act. Alexander nodded, though he wondered if the Prime Minister would have the political courage to move against the Queen Consort. Anyone else?
Your cousin James has always been ambitious. He's fourth in line for the throne after you and Edmund, but if we could prove that Victoria murdered Isabella and was planning to manipulate the succession, James might see an opportunity to advance his own position by supporting us.
The suggestion made Alexander uncomfortable.
Using family ambition as leverage felt disturbingly similar to Victoria's own methods, but he recognized that they needed to be strategic about building a coalition.
What about Dr. Eleanor Whitmore? Alexander asked.
If we could convince her to examine Isabella's remains, her findings would be difficult to dispute. Eleanor is brilliant and honest, but she's also cautious. She won't risk her career without compelling evidence that would stand up to scrutiny. We would need more than the diary to convince her to perform an unauthorized examination. Robert moved to his desk and retrieved a leather portfolio.
There is one avenue we haven't discussed.
I have contacts in the intelligence services who might be willing to investigate Victoria's financial activities.
If she was paying bribes or receiving money from foreign sources, those transactions would leave traces. You think she might be working for someone else?
I think Victoria is primarily motivated by her desire to see Edmund on the throne, but she's also shown an unusual interest in certain foreign policy decisions. Last year, she lobbied hard for a trade agreement with a particular Eastern European country, despite objections from the Foreign Office. When I researched that country, I discovered they have significant investments in pharmaceutical companies. The implication was chilling. If Victoria had financial ties to foreign pharmaceutical interests, Isabella's death might have served multiple purposes beyond just clearing the path for Edmund's eventual succession.
How do we proceed without alerting Victoria that we're investigating her?
Very carefully, Robert replied. Victoria has spent years building a network of loyal supporters within the palace. There are people who report to her either because they're true believers in her vision or because they're afraid of what happens to those who oppose her. We have to assume that everything we do will eventually get back to her.
Alexander felt the walls closing in around him. So we're fighting an enemy who has more resources, more allies, and years of preparation on her side?
Yes, but we have advantages too. The truth is powerful, even when it's difficult to prove. People who have worked closely with Victoria have seen glimpses of her real nature, and some of them are beginning to have doubts about her methods.
We also have the element of surprise.
Victoria thinks she's successfully managed you, and she won't expect you to mount a serious challenge to her authority.
Robert opened the portfolio and spread several documents across his desk. I've been quietly gathering information about Victoria's activities for the past 2 years. Financial records, travel itineraries, meeting schedules.
Individually, these documents don't prove anything, but together they paint a picture of someone who has been systematically building power and influence while operating in the shadows. Alexander examined the documents, seeing patterns that he had never noticed before. Victoria's travels consistently coincided with political developments that benefited her positions. Her charitable foundation received donations from companies that later received favorable treatment in government contracts. Her social calendar included regular meetings with people who officially had no business with the royal family.
This is impressive work, Uncle. Why haven't you acted on this before?
Because suspicion isn't proof, and failed accusations against someone like Victoria would be worse than making no accusations at all.
But Isabella's diary changes the equation.
It provides context for these activities and suggests a motive that makes sense of the patterns. As they continued reviewing the documents, Alexander began to understand the scope of Victoria's operation. She hadn't simply decided to eliminate Isabella on a whim, she had been building toward this moment for years, creating the infrastructure necessary to control the monarchy through Edmund.
There's something else you need to consider, Robert said after a long pause.
If we're right about Victoria's involvement in Isabella's death, and if she's prepared to challenge your succession, then your life may also be in danger. The thought had occurred to Alexander, but hearing it spoken aloud made the threat feel more real.
You think she would try to kill me?
I think Victoria has demonstrated that she's willing to eliminate anyone who stands in the way of her goals. You're a much more challenging target than Isabella was, but if she feels cornered or if she sees an opportunity, she might decide that the risks are worth taking. Alexander felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool evening air filtering through the chamber's windows. He had entered this investigation seeking justice for his wife, but he was beginning to realize that it might cost him his own life.
What do you recommend?
Increase your personal security, but do it quietly.
Vary your routines. Don't eat or drink anything that hasn't been prepared by people you absolutely trust.
And, most importantly, don't underestimate Victoria's intelligence or her ruthlessness. As their meeting drew to a close, Robert handed Alexander a small device that looked like an ordinary pen.
This is a recording device. If you have any more conversations with Victoria, use it.
Her admissions yesterday were valuable, but they need to be documented if we're going to use them against her. Alexander pocketed the device, understanding that he was crossing a line from which there might be no return. Recording conversations with the Queen Consort could be considered treason if the wrong people discovered it, but it might also be the key to proving Victoria's guilt.
One more thing, Robert said as Alexander prepared to leave.
Be very careful about who you trust going forward. Victoria has had years to identify and cultivate people who might be useful to her.
Some of them might surprise you.
As Alexander walked back through the darkened corridors of the palace, he felt the weight of knowledge settling around him like a shroud. Every shadow could hide a potential threat, every friendly face might belong to one of Victoria's allies. The palace that had been his home since birth now felt like enemy territory, and he realized that the battle for his throne and his life was only just beginning. The next phase of his investigation would require him to step even further into dangerous territory, but Alexander knew there was no turning back. Isabella deserved justice, and the kingdom deserved a ruler who had earned the throne through legitimate succession rather than murder and manipulation. Whether he would survive long enough to claim either remained to be seen. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace gardens as Alexander made his way to the secluded gazebo where he had arranged to meet Dr. Eleanor Whitmore. The kingdom's most respected forensic pathologist had agreed to this clandestine meeting only after Alexander had convinced her that matters of national security were at stake. Even so, he could see the apprehension in her posture as she stood near the ornate structure, her medical bag clutched tightly in her hand. "Your Highness," Dr. Whitmore said with a slight bow as Alexander approached. She was a woman in her 50s, with prematurely gray hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "I must admit, your message was rather cryptic. What exactly requires such secrecy?" Alexander had prepared carefully for this conversation, knowing that Dr. Whitmore's cooperation would be essential for building a case against Victoria. He produced a folder containing copies of Isabella's medical records, both the official ones and the discrepancies he had discovered through his investigation. "Doctor, I need your professional opinion on my wife's treatment and death," Alexander began. "But first, I need your word that this conversation will remain strictly confidential until we decide how to proceed." Dr. Whitmore's expression grew serious. "If this involves suspected malpractice or worse, I have ethical obligations that might override confidentiality concerns." "I understand, and I'm hoping you'll help me determine exactly what those obligations require," Alexander replied, handing her the folder. As Dr. Whitmore reviewed the documents, Alexander watched her face for reactions. He could see the moment when she noticed the discrepancies between the official treatment plan and the actual medications found in Isabella's system. Her frown deepened as she compared laboratory results with physicians' notes. "This is highly irregular," she said after several minutes. "The medications listed in these toxicology reports weren't prescribed by any of the attending physicians. In fact, some of these combinations could be quite dangerous, particularly for someone in Princess Isabella's condition." "Dangerous how?" "This particular psychotropic medication, when combined with the cardiac drug she was officially receiving, could cause severe disorientation, memory loss, and potentially fatal heart arrhythmias. Any competent physician would know better than to prescribe them together." Alexander felt his suspicions being confirmed by an expert whose opinion would carry significant weight in any investigation. "Is there any legitimate medical reason why someone might have given her these drugs?" Dr. Whitmore continued studying the records, occasionally making notes in the margins. "Not based on the documented symptoms and condition. If anything, these medications would have worsened her prognosis significantly." "Doctor, I need to ask you something that may sound shocking," Alexander said carefully. "Is it possible that someone was deliberately poisoning my wife?" The accusation hung in the air between them like a thunderclap. Dr. Whitmore looked up from the documents, her face pale with the implications of what Alexander was suggesting. "Poisoning is a strong word, Your Highness. But these records do suggest that Princess Isabella was receiving medications that were not in her best medical interest, and that those medications may have contributed to her death." "Could you prove that if you were able to examine her remains?" Dr. Whitmore set down the folder and looked directly at Alexander. "Your Highness,
What exactly are you asking me to do?
I'm asking you to help me determine whether my wife was murdered, and, if so, by whom. The weight of the request was evident in Dr. Whitmore's expression. She understood that she was being asked to potentially expose a conspiracy at the highest levels of the royal family, with all the personal and professional risks that such an investigation would entail. If I were to conduct such an examination, I would need proper authorization and laboratory facilities that could guarantee the integrity of the results, she said slowly.
What if I could provide both?
Dr. Whitmore stood and began pacing around the gazebo, clearly struggling with the decision. Your Highness, if someone in the royal family is responsible for Princess Isabella's death, then investigating it puts both of us in considerable danger.
I'm aware of the risks, Alexander replied.
But I can't let my wife's murder go unpunished, regardless of who was responsible.
You're certain it was murder? Alexander produced Isabella's diary from his jacket pocket.
Read this, and, then, tell me what you think. Dr. Whitmore accepted the diary with trembling hands, her medical training making her approach the document as evidence rather than simply a personal account. As she read, Alexander could see her professional objectivity being challenged by the emotional impact of Isabella's words. My God, she whispered when she finished reading. If this is accurate, then someone was systematically poisoning her while maintaining the facade of medical treatment. The person responsible is someone with access to the royal medical facilities, someone who could influence the attending physicians, and someone who had both motive and opportunity to orchestrate Isabella's death, Alexander said. Dr. Whitmore didn't need him to specify who he suspected, the implications were clear enough.
Your Highness, I need you to understand what you're asking.
If we proceed with an investigation and we're wrong, both of our careers and possibly our lives will be destroyed. If we're right, we'll be exposing a conspiracy that could destabilize the entire kingdom. And if we do nothing, a murderer remains free and in position to kill again, Alexander countered. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching through the garden. Alexander tensed, wondering if they had been discovered, but relaxed slightly when he recognized the figure of Marcus Holbrook, the guard who had originally found Isabella's diary. Your Highness, Marcus said as he approached the gazebo. I apologize for interrupting, but there's something urgent you need to know. I've been conducting discreet inquiries as you requested, and I've discovered something troubling. Alexander introduced Marcus to Dr. Whitmore, explaining the guard's role in uncovering the truth about Isabella's death. Marcus nodded respectfully to the doctor before turning his attention back to Alexander. Sir, I've learned that Dr. Harrison, Princess Isabella's primary physician during her final weeks, didn't simply relocate to Switzerland as we initially thought. According to my sources, he's been seen in the company of several known intelligence operatives from foreign governments. The revelation added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. If foreign powers were involved in Isabella's death, the conspiracy extended far beyond the royal family's internal politics.
Which governments? Alexander asked.
That's where it gets interesting, sir. The operatives are from the same Eastern European country that Queen Consort Victoria has been promoting for increased trade relations. The same country that has significant investments in pharmaceutical companies.
Dr. Whitmore looked confused. What does this mean for our investigation?
Alexander explained Robert's theory about Victoria's potential foreign connections, and how Isabella's death might have served multiple purposes beyond simply clearing the path for Edmund's succession.
If Victoria was working with foreign interests, then Isabella's murder was not just about family politics, Alexander realized.
It was about positioning someone controllable on the throne, someone who would advance policies beneficial to those foreign powers.
Marcus nodded grimly.
There's more, sir. I've also learned that several key positions within the palace security apparatus have been quietly filled with people who have personal connections to Queen Consort Victoria. The head of your personal protection detail, the supervisor of food services, even the coordinator of medical services have all been replaced within the past 2 years.
The implications were staggering.
Victoria had been systematically placing her allies in positions where they could monitor, influence, or potentially harm anyone who threatened her plans.
Doctor, Alexander said, turning to Dr. Whitmore, I think you can see that this situation extends far beyond a simple case of medical malpractice. We're dealing with a conspiracy that threatens the independence of the kingdom itself.
Dr. Whitmore sat down heavily on one of the gazebo's benches, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of what she was learning. Your Highness, even if I agree to help you, conducting a forensic examination of Princess Isabella's remains would require careful planning and absolute discretion. If Victoria's people discover what we're doing before we have conclusive results, the evidence could be destroyed and we could all end up dead.
What would you need to conduct a proper examination? Alexander asked.
Access to the royal crypt, laboratory facilities that are secure and independent, and tissue samples that haven't been contaminated or tampered with. Most importantly, I would need assurance that the results of the examination would be protected and properly presented to appropriate authorities.
Marcus spoke up.
Sir, I may be able to help with access to the crypt. I have contacts among the security staff who are loyal to the crown rather than to any individual member of the royal family. If we time it correctly, we could conduct the examination without alerting Victoria's people.
Alexander felt a surge of hope.
With Dr. Whitmore's expertise, Marcus's security access, and his uncle Robert's political connections, they might actually be able to build a case strong enough to bring Victoria to justice. There's one more thing we need to consider, Dr. Whitmore said. If we're going to accuse Queen Consort Victoria of murder, we need to be prepared for her to fight back. She won't simply accept exposure and punishment quietly. She'll use every resource at her disposal to discredit us and protect herself.
What kind of resources? Marcus asked.
Political influence, media manipulation, character assassination, and, potentially violence, Alexander replied, thinking of his uncle's warnings about the dangers they faced. Victoria has spent years building a network of supporters and placing her people in key positions. When we move against her, she'll know almost immediately, and she'll have multiple ways to respond. Dr. Whitmore stood and gathered the documents they had been reviewing. Your Highness, I need 24 hours to consider everything you've told me. This decision will affect not just my life, but potentially the future of the kingdom.
I want to be absolutely certain that we're pursuing the right course of action.
Alexander understood her hesitation, but he also knew that time was working against them. Every day they delayed gave Victoria more opportunities to consolidate her power and eliminate potential threats. Doctor, I respect your need for time to consider this decision. But I want you to understand that if we don't act soon, Victoria may make the choice for us by eliminating anyone who poses a threat to her plans. As they prepared to part ways, Alexander felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders in a way it never had before. The decisions he made in the coming days would determine not just whether justice was served for Isabella's murder, but whether he would live to claim his rightful place as king, and whether the kingdom would remain independent or fall under the influence of foreign powers working through Victoria's conspiracy. The game Victoria had been playing for years was approaching its endgame, and Alexander realized that he had only just begun to understand the true scope of the forces arrayed against him. The royal crypt beneath Thornwick Cathedral lay shrouded in darkness that seemed to press against the feeble light cast by Dr. Whitmore's specialized forensic lamps. Alexander stood beside Isabella's marble sarcophagus, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he was about to disturb his beloved wife's rest in pursuit of justice. Marcus had successfully arranged for their clandestine access to the crypt, ensuring that the guards on duty were men whose loyalty to the crown exceeded their fear of Victoria's retribution. Dr. Whitmore worked with methodical precision, her trained hands steady despite the gravity of what they were attempting. She had agreed to conduct the examination after spending a sleepless night reviewing the evidence and consulting with trusted colleagues who confirmed her assessment that the medication combinations found in Isabella's system were not just inappropriate, but potentially lethal. The preservation is better than I expected, Dr. Whitmore murmured as she carefully collected tissue samples. The royal embalming process, while thorough, shouldn't interfere with detecting the specific toxins we're looking for. Alexander watched in respectful silence as the doctor worked, each sample she collected representing another piece of evidence that might finally prove Victoria's guilt. The process was deeply disturbing on an emotional level, but Alexander forced himself to focus on the larger purpose they were serving.
How long before we have results? Alexander asked quietly. The basic toxicology screening can be completed within 12 hours using portable equipment I've brought. For more detailed analysis, including testing for exotic compounds or sophisticated poisons, we'll need to use the main laboratory facilities. That could take several days. Marcus, who had been monitoring the entrance to the crypt, approached with a concerned expression. Your Highness, we may have a problem. I've received word that Queen Consort Victoria has been asking questions about your whereabouts. She's also requested a meeting with the head of palace security for later today. The timing was suspicious, suggesting that Victoria might have discovered their investigation or at least sensed that something was amiss. Alexander realized they were rapidly approaching the point where secrecy would no longer be possible. Doctor, how quickly can you complete the initial analysis? If we work through the night, I can have preliminary results by dawn, Dr. Whitmore replied, sealing the final sample container. But, we'll need a secure location where I can set up my equipment without risk of discovery. Alexander had anticipated this need and made arrangements with his uncle Robert to use a private laboratory facility owned by a trusted friend of the family. As they carefully packed up the evidence and prepared to leave the crypt, Alexander felt the weight of the moment. They were past the point of no return. If Victoria discovered what they had done, the consequences would be swift and severe. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of tense waiting and careful preparation. While Dr. Whitmore conducted her analysis, Alexander and Robert worked to secure the support they would need when the truth about Isabella's death became public. Prime Minister Harrison had agreed to a private meeting based on Robert's assurance that matters of national security were involved, though he remained skeptical about taking action against the Queen Consort without overwhelming evidence. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the laboratory windows, Dr. Whitmore emerged from her work area with a grim expression that told Alexander everything he needed to know even before she spoke. The levels of psychotropic compounds in Princess Isabella's system were far beyond any therapeutic dosage, she announced, her voice heavy with professional authority. In fact, they were consistent with deliberate poisoning administered over a period of several weeks. The combination of drugs would have caused progressive neurological deterioration, cardiac irregularities, and, ultimately, respiratory failure. Alexander felt a mixture of vindication and renewed grief. Isabella had indeed been murdered, slowly and systematically, by someone she had trusted to care for her. Is there any possibility that these levels could have resulted from accidental overdose or medical error? Robert asked, thinking ahead to the legal challenges they would face. None whatsoever, Dr. Whitmore replied firmly. The specific combination and dosage patterns indicate deliberate administration by someone with sophisticated knowledge of pharmacology. This was not the work of an amateur. Armed with conclusive forensic evidence, Alexander knew the time had come to present their findings to the proper authorities. However, their plans were disrupted by an urgent message from Marcus, who had been monitoring communications within the palace. Your Highness, Marcus reported breathlessly as he arrived at the laboratory. Queen Consort Victoria has called an emergency meeting of the Privy Council for this afternoon. According to my sources, she plans to present evidence that you've been suffering from a mental breakdown and that you're unfit to assume the throne. The news struck Alexander like a physical blow. Victoria had anticipated their investigation and was moving to neutralize the threat by having him declared mentally incompetent before he could present his evidence against her. What kind of evidence could she possibly have? Alexander demanded. Testimony from palace staff about your recent erratic behavior, reports from physicians about your emotional state following Princess Isabella's death, and, apparently, some kind of documentation suggesting that you've been making paranoid accusations against members of your own family, Marcus explained. Alexander realized that Victoria had been planning this contingency for months, carefully gathering ammunition she could use to discredit him if he became a threat to her plans. Every conversation he'd had with palace staff, every moment of grief he displayed following Isabella's death, had been documented and twisted to support a narrative of mental instability. We need to move faster than planned, Robert said urgently. If the Privy Council declares Alexander unfit to rule, Edmund becomes the heir apparent, and Victoria achieves everything she's been working toward. Dr. Whitmore gathered her forensic reports and sealed them in an official evidence container.
Your Highness, these results prove conclusively that Princess Isabella was murdered. If you present this evidence to the Privy Council before they vote on your competency, it should be enough to expose Victoria's conspiracy and vindicate your actions. However, their plans were further complicated by the arrival of Edmund himself, accompanied by several guards that Alexander didn't recognize. His half-brother's usual easy smile was replaced by an expression of cold determination that Alexander had never seen before. "Alexander," Edmund said with formal courtesy, "I'm afraid I need to ask you to come with me. Mother has some concerns about your recent behavior that need to be addressed." The use of the word mother to describe Victoria, rather than the more formal queen consort, told Alexander everything he needed to know about Edmund's loyalties. His half-brother had been fully recruited into Victoria's conspiracy and was now actively working to remove Alexander from the line of succession. "I'm not going anywhere until I've spoken with the Prime Minister," Alexander replied firmly. Edmund's expression hardened. "I'm afraid that's not an option. The guards have orders to escort you to the palace for immediate medical evaluation. If you resist, they're authorized to use whatever force is necessary." Alexander looked at the guards accompanying Edmund and realized that none of them were men he recognized from his usual security detail. These were Victoria's people, brought in specifically for this moment. "Edmund, you need to listen to me," Alexander said urgently. "Victoria murdered Isabella. We have forensic evidence that proves it conclusively. She's been manipulating all of us, including you." For just a moment, Alexander thought he saw doubt flicker in his half-brother's eyes. But it disappeared quickly, replaced by what appeared to be genuine conviction. "Alexander, I know you loved Isabella, and I know her death was devastating for you. But these paranoid fantasies about mother are exactly what we're trying to help you address. You're sick, and you need treatment." The sincerity in Edmund's voice was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire confrontation. Alexander realized that Victoria had been so successful in her manipulation that Edmund genuinely believed he was acting in Alexander's best interests by helping to have him declared incompetent. Marcus stepped forward, his hand moving to his weapon. "Your Highness, I can get you out of here, but we need to move quickly." Alexander faced an impossible choice. If he fled, it would only support Victoria's narrative that he was mentally unstable and dangerous. If he allowed himself to be taken into custody, he might never get the chance to present his evidence about Isabella's murder. Dr. Whitmore made the decision for him. "Mr. Holbrook, take the evidence containers and get them to Prime Minister Harrison immediately." "Your Highness, I'll go with you and testify about the forensic results at the Privy Council meeting." It was a risky strategy, but Alexander realized it might be their only chance. If Dr. Whitmore could present her findings directly to the Privy Council members, the scientific evidence might overcome Victoria's political maneuvering. As they were escorted from the laboratory, Alexander caught sight of Victoria waiting in the palace courtyard. She stood beside a medical transport vehicle, her expression a perfect mask of concerned stepmother worried about her disturbed stepson. But, when their eyes met, Alexander saw the cold satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid plans were finally coming to fruition. "Alexander, darling," Victoria said with apparent warmth as they approached. "I know this is difficult, but Dr. Matthews is waiting to help you through this crisis. Once you've had proper treatment, you'll be able to see that these delusions about Isabella's death were just your mind's way of coping with grief." The mention of Dr. Matthews, the palace psychiatrist who had always been one of Victoria's supporters, confirmed Alexander's worst fears about what kind of treatment was being planned for him. "Victoria," Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "I know what you did to Isabella. I have proof of how you poisoned her, and I know about your foreign connections. This isn't over." Victoria's mask slipped for just an instant, revealing the cold fury beneath her motherly concern. "Oh, my dear boy," she said softly, "I'm afraid it is." As Alexander was loaded into the medical transport, he caught sight of Marcus disappearing into the morning crowds of the city, carrying the evidence that represented their last hope for justice. The game Victoria had been playing for years was reaching its climax, and Alexander realized that the next few hours would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the entire kingdom.
the vehicle pulled away from the palace, carrying Alexander toward what Victoria intended to be his final defeat.
But, even as he watched the familiar towers of his ancestral home disappear behind them, Alexander maintained hope that the truth would ultimately prevail, and that Isabella's murder would not go unpunished, regardless of the personal cost to himself. The battle for the throne, for justice, and for the very soul of the kingdom was far from over, even as Alexander found himself apparently defeated by forces that had been working against him far longer than he had understood. In the end, the question would be whether the evidence could speak louder than political manipulation, and whether the truth could overcome the carefully constructed lies that had brought them all to this moment of crisis.